There is a kind of silence that powerful people mistake for weakness. They see a woman who doesn't raise her voice at the dinner table, and they think she has nothing worth saying. They see a woman who smiles through insults, and they think she has no teeth. They see a woman who signs no paperwork, makes no speeches, and attends no board meetings, and they assume she owns nothing. They are almost always wrong. And the ones who are wrong about her, the most spectacularly, catastrophically wrong, tend to find out not with a letter, not with a phone call, but with a trembling in their hands that starts the moment they realize the floor beneath everything they ever built was never actually theirs. This is the story of Camille Renee Beaumont Ashford, and this story begins, as so many do, at a dinner table.
Hi, I'm Ray. Welcome to my channel, Tales of the Heart by Ray. I am glad to have you as part of my community. Please comment where you are watching from. I would like to know. Please don't forget to like, comment, share, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel for more beautiful and interesting stories.
The Ashford family home in River Oaks, Houston, Texas, was the kind of house that made people forget their manners. Not because it was overwhelming in a crass or ostentatious way. No, it was worse than that. It was the kind of beautiful that made people feel small, without quite knowing why. The ceilings were 14 feet high. The chandeliers were Italian. The dining room table was reclaimed oak from a French estate that had been dismantled in 1947, and it sat 18 people comfortably, without anyone having to raise their voice to be heard. Everything about the house said old money, even though the Ashfords were, at best, second-generation wealthy, a fact that the family worked very hard never to discuss. On the evening of October the 14th, a Thursday, that table was set for 11. Sterling Ashford sat at the head, as he always did. He was 51 years old, broad-shouldered, with the kind of salt and pepper hair that men's magazine editors put on covers with the word distinguished in the headline. He was the CEO of Ashford Capital Group, a mid-sized private equity firm that had been built on the foundation of family connections, strategic marriages, and, if one looked closely enough at the formation documents, a very particular banking relationship that everyone in the room took for granted. Sterling was the kind of man who had never once, in his adult life, been told no by anyone he considered important. Seated to his left was his mother, Eleanor Ashford, née Calloway, a 73-year-old woman from old Galveston society who still wore pearls to dinner and believed that the purpose of a wife was to be presentable and grateful. Eleanor had disapproved of Camille from the first night Sterling had brought her home, and she had never once tried to hide it. She called it having standards. Everyone else called it what it was. Seated around the table were Sterling's two brothers, Beau, 47, and Reginald, 44, along with their wives, their adult children, and two family friends whose presence that evening would later become legally significant in ways none of them anticipated. And at the far end of the table, in the chair that faced the window rather than the room, sat Camille. She was 38 years old. She was the daughter of Louis René Beaumont, a black entrepreneur from New Orleans who had built a small empire in commercial real estate before his death, and of Isabelle Tran Beaumont, a Vietnamese-American woman from Houston who had been a corporate attorney before she retired to manage the Beaumont family estate. Camille had her father's calm and her mother's precision. She had grown up understanding money not as a symbol of status, but as a tool, something you wielded quietly and put away before anyone got the wrong idea about who you were. She wore a deep burgundy dress that evening. She had brought flowers for the table, pale ivory ranunculus that no one acknowledged. She had arrived on time. She had greeted Eleanor with a kiss on the cheek that was not returned. She sat at the far end of the table, and she watched, and she listened, and she kept her face perfectly, almost professionally, still. Sterling raised his glass at exactly 7:42 in the evening. He had the look of a man who had rehearsed what he was about to do, not nervously, but methodically. The way you rehearse a presentation you are confident will land. He cleared his throat. The table went quiet. Even the servers, two young women in black uniforms, paused near the side credenza. "I want to take a moment," Sterling said, "to address something that has come to my attention regarding the Ashford Capital operating accounts." Camille did not move. Our firm's internal audit team, Sterling continued, has identified a discrepancy in the transaction records from the third quarter. Specifically, a series of withdrawals from the operating fund, totaling approximately $2.3 million, that cannot be reconciled against any authorized expenditure. He paused. He let the number sit in the air. He looked directly at Camille. The access logs trace back to credentials registered under Camille's name. The room went still in a way that rooms only go still when something has shifted in a direction that cannot be undone. Eleanor set down her fork. Beau's wife, Dana, put her hand over her mouth. Reginald looked at the table. Camille looked at Sterling. "That," she said, very quietly, "is not accurate." "I have the documentation," Sterling said. "Then your documentation is fabricated," Camille said. She said it the same way one might say the weather is turning, not as an accusation loaded with emotion, but as a simple observation of fact. The dinner table erupted. Not in shouting, the Ashfords were too managed for that, but in the particular kind of chaos that well-bred people produce when they are pretending to be calm while being anything but. Eleanor said something about always knowing. Beau said something about protecting the firm. Reginald said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Sterling called the police at 8:19 that evening. Camille was at that point still seated at the dining table, finishing her water, her hands folded in her lap. 2 Houston Police Department officers arrived at 8:53. Sterling met them at the door. He handed them a folder. The folder contained printed transaction records, access logs, and a sworn affidavit from Ashford Capital's internal compliance officer, a man named Darren Foss, who had been with the firm for 3 years and who drove a vehicle whose monthly payments, it would later be established, exceeded his salary by a factor that deserved its own investigation. Camille was arrested at 9:17. She was handcuffed in the entryway of the River Oaks house, beneath the Italian chandelier, in front of Sterling's family. She did not cry. She did not argue with the officers. She said, clearly and calmly, "I would like to call my attorney." One of the officers nodded. She was walked out through the front door. The ivory ranunculus she had brought sat untouched in their vase on the side table. Sterling watched her go. He had the expression of a man who believed the hardest part was over. He was wrong about almost everything. To understand what happened next, you need to understand who Camille Beaumont Ashford actually was. Not the version her husband's family had constructed, not the woman they had decided she was before they ever asked, but the real person, the full person, the one they had never bothered to see. Camille was born in New Orleans, Louisiana, in the spring of 1986, the only child of Louis and Isabel Beaumont. Her father's family had roots in Louisiana, going back generations. Black Creole, Catholic, deeply tied to the city's particular culture of food and music and commerce and survival. Louis Beaumont had started his first business at 22, with a $10,000 loan from his grandmother, and a stubbornness that people who knew him described as almost supernatural. By the time Camille was born, he owned 17 commercial properties across 3 Gulf states. By the time she was 10, he had quietly expanded into financial services. By the time she was 15, he had established what would eventually become the cornerstone of everything. But Louis Beaumont was not a man who announced himself. He was a man who built things and then arranged them so carefully that no one outside his most trusted circle knew the full picture. He had grown up in a country that had spent centuries trying to make sure men who looked like him never accumulated the kind of wealth that allowed them to say no, and he had internalized that history not with bitterness, but with strategy. He kept his name off of certain things. He built holding structures that were layers deep. He registered controlling interests through trust instruments that could not be easily unwound. He was not hiding. He was protecting. He brought Camille into this world of careful architecture early. By the time she was in high school, she understood trust law better than most law school graduates. By the time she graduated from Spelman College with a degree in finance, she had already sat through more board meetings, quietly, observingly, as her father's silent companion, than most people attend in a career. She went on to earn an MBA from Wharton, not because she needed the credential, but because her father believed in understanding the language that the rooms she would one day enter were conducted in. She met Sterling Ashford at a charity gala in Houston in 2012. He was handsome, charming, and he looked at her with the kind of attention that felt, at first, like genuine interest. She was cautious. She was always cautious. But she was also 24, and there was something in him, a restlessness, an ambition, that felt familiar. She did not yet understand that the ambition she was recognizing was not the same as her father's. Her father's ambition was generative. Sterling's was extractive. That distinction would take years to fully reveal itself. They married in 2014. She wore her grandmother's ring. Her father danced with her and whispered something in her ear that she would not repeat to anyone for a very long time. What Camille had never told Sterling, what she had told almost no one, was the nature of her inheritance. When Louis Beaumont died in 2019 after a brief illness, he left behind an estate that was structured with the kind of deliberate complexity that takes years to fully comprehend. The surface layer, the commercial real estate holdings, the investment portfolio, the Houston properties, these were relatively visible. These were the things that people who knew of the Beaumont family were aware of. What was not visible was Beaumont Capital Reserve LLC. Beaumont Capital Reserve was a private investment bank, not a boutique advisory firm, not a family office, but a fully licensed, fully operational private institution that held approximately $5 billion in assets under management and maintained corporate banking relationships with a select group of institutional clients. It did not advertise. It did not court press. Its name appeared nowhere on any list that ordinary people read. Its leadership structure was a series of nominee directors organized through a Delaware holding entity, beneath which sat an irrevocable trust, the Beaumont Family Preservation Trust, of which Camille Renee Beaumont Ashford was the sole controlling beneficiary. Among the corporate accounts held by Beaumont Capital Reserve was one belonging to Ashford Capital Group. Sterling had no idea. He had been banking with Beaumont Capital Reserve for 14 years. The relationship had been brokered by a third-party financial advisor before he and Camille even met, and the bank's branding gave no indication of its ownership structure. To Sterling, it was simply a private bank with excellent terms, a discreet reputation, and a relationship manager named Mr. Claude Whitfield, who answered his calls on the first ring. He had married the woman who owned his bank, and he had never once suspected it. This was not an accident. Her father had known, with a certainty born of lifelong experience, that the moment you announce what you own, people begin trying to take it from you. Camille honored his wisdom. She kept the secret. She wore Sterling's name. She attended his family dinners. She smiled at Eleanor's thinly veiled hostility. She filed away every indignity with the quiet discipline of a woman who understood that patience is not the same as surrender. She had told herself she would reveal it when the time was right. Perhaps when they had built something together, worth protecting. Perhaps when she was certain the man she had married was the man she had believed him to be. But the time she had imagined never came, because Sterling, the man she had believed him to be, had never fully existed. The thing about betrayal is that it rarely arrives fully formed. It grows incrementally, in small decisions that individually seem survivable and collectively become catastrophic. Sterling Ashford's betrayal had been growing for at least 4 years before that October dinner. Her name was Vanessa Bright. She was 34, a financial analyst who had joined Ashford Capital Group in 2021 as a senior associate. She was sharp, well-dressed, and entirely willing to blur the lines between professional ambition and personal gain in ways that Sterling found not threatening but exciting. Their affair began approximately 8 months after she started. It was not, by either of their accounts, a grand passion. It was an arrangement of mutual utility, dressed in the language of romance, and it suited them both. Vanessa understood numbers. She understood, specifically, the kind of numbers that appear in corporate accounts and the various creative ways those numbers could be redirected. She also understood Sterling, his ego, his need to be seen as powerful, his anxiety beneath the confidence. And she used that understanding the way a skilled surgeon uses a scalpel, precisely, deliberately, without wasting a single motion. The scheme they constructed together was not entirely unsophisticated, but it was not elegant either. It depended on a level of arrogance, specifically, the arrogance of people who believe they will never be truly scrutinized, that tends to create its own vulnerabilities. They had established 3 shell companies. The first was registered in Wyoming under the name Brightstone Advisory Partners. The second was a Nevada LLC called Ashfield Holding Solutions. Note the deliberate blurring of Ashford and Ashfield, an arrogance so brazen it bordered on the theatrical. The third was a Texas entity called Gulf Meridian Capital, registered under the name of a cousin of Vanessa's who would later claim, convincingly, to have had no genuine knowledge of what the company was being used for. Through these 3 entities, Sterling and Vanessa had been siphoning money from Ashford Capital Group's operating accounts over a period of roughly 18 months. The mechanism was simple. Fictitious vendor contracts, paid out of the operating fund, routed through the shell companies, and ultimately landing in accounts that Vanessa controlled. The total amount extracted, by the time investigators would eventually tally the full picture, was closer to $4.7 million. Not the $2.3 million that Sterling had cited at the dinner table, a discrepancy that was not an error. The $2.3 million he had cited was the amount he had decided to attribute to Camille. He had spent time on this. He had worked with Darren Foss, the compliance officer, to construct a parallel set of documentation, access logs with Camille's credentials, transaction records with her digital signature markers, a paper trail designed to look like the work of a woman quietly pillaging her husband's firm. The documentation was not perfect. It could not be, because it was built on fabrication, but it was sufficient to arrest her, sufficient to create a public narrative, and sufficient to buy time. Time was what Sterling needed. He needed time to finalize the dissolution of the marriage, to move the remaining extracted funds to a position where they would be difficult to trace, and to establish, legally and publicly, a narrative in which he was the victim and Camille was the criminal. Once she was arrested and charged, the story would solidify. She would be under pressure to settle, to accept a plea deal, to sign documents, to go quietly. Her name would be the one in the news. His would be the one that survived. That was the plan. It was detailed. It had multiple components. It accounted for several contingencies. It did not account for Camille. The Harris County Jail was not designed to be comfortable, and Camille did not expect it to be. She was processed with the efficiency that the system applied to everyone, fingerprinted, photographed, issued a wristband. She sat in the holding area for 40 minutes before she was allowed her phone call, and she spent those 40 minutes in a state of complete internal stillness that the officer on duty would later describe, in a statement to investigators, as the calmest person I have ever seen in intake. Her phone call lasted 4 minutes. She called a number she had memorized, not saved, a habit her father had taught her. The line rang twice. A man answered. His name was Harrison Cole, and he was the senior managing partner of Cole, Laurent & Washington, LLP, a Houston-based law firm that specialized in complex financial litigation, white-collar criminal defense, and, when the situation called for it, the kind of corporate restructuring that required someone who had seen absolutely everything and was startled by nothing. Harrison Cole was 61 years old. He was a black man from Beaumont, Texas, who had graduated from Howard University School of Law at the top of his class in 1988, and had spent the subsequent 3 decades becoming, in the estimation of people who knew how these things worked, one of the most quietly formidable legal minds in the state. He had been Louis Beaumont's attorney for 20 years. He had attended Camille's wedding. He had sat across from her at the reading of Louis's will and watched her face as the full scope of her inheritance was laid out, and he had seen nothing there that surprised him, because she already knew. He had also, in the years since Louis's death, been waiting, not hoping for something bad to happen. He was not that kind of man, but he was the kind of man who, when Louis Beaumont told him, as Louis did, 2 months before his death, "Harrison, there is going to come a day when someone tries to take what belongs to my daughter, and I need you to be ready." He listened, and he prepared, and he did not forget. When Camille's call came in at 10:47 on that October Thursday, Harrison Cole said, "I'll be there in the morning. Don't sign anything. Don't speak to anyone without me present. Do you understand?" She said yes. She hung up. She folded her hands in her lap, and she waited. Houston mornings in October carry a particular quality of light, warm and angled, cutting through the humidity in a way that makes everything look clarified. Harrison Cole arrived at Harris County Jail at 7:52 a.m. in a charcoal suit and carrying a briefcase that had been with him so long it had acquired a kind of dignity. He was accompanied by two associates from his firm, Priya Subramaniam, a 35-year-old forensic finance specialist who had previously worked for the SEC, and Marcus Webb, a 30-year-old former federal prosecutor who had joined the firm 18 months earlier and who had, as Harrison described it, a particular talent for finding the thing that someone does not want found. They met with Camille for 2 hours in the attorney visitation room. She was calm, precise, and thorough. She walked them through the dinner, the accusation, the arrest, the specific language Sterling had used, the names of everyone present. She described Darren Foss and her assessment of him. She noted the exact figure Sterling had cited, 2.3 million. And she told Harrison that she believed the number was deliberate. He chose a number, she said. Not a round number, a specific number. That tells me the documentation exists already. It was prepared. Harrison nodded slowly. We'll need 3 things, he said. 1, the actual transaction records from Ashford Capital Group, which we'll subpoena. 2, the access log metadata. Not just the logs themselves, but the underlying technical data about when and where the credentials were used. And 3, he paused, looking at Camille steadily. We need to think very carefully about the moment of disclosure. She knew what he meant. Not yet, she said. Not yet, he agreed. There was a bail hearing that afternoon. The prosecutor, a younger man named Ellison Grant, who was 2 years out of law school and clearly working from the documentation Sterling's team had provided, argued for a bail of $1 million, citing the alleged amount of the theft and what he termed flight risk considerations based on the defendant's significant financial resources. Harrison stood up. He was not a man who raised his voice in courtrooms. He had learned early in his career that the attorneys who shout are almost always the ones who are losing. He spoke quietly, methodically, and with the particular authority of someone who has never, not once, wasted a judge's time. He noted that his client had no prior criminal history. He noted that his client was a lifelong Texas resident with deep community ties. He noted that the documentation on which the charges were based was currently the subject of significant evidentiary dispute, and that his firm had already initiated the process of securing independent forensic analysis of the transaction records. He asked for a bail of $100,000. The judge set it at $250,000. Camille was out before 6 o'clock that evening. She did not return to the River Oaks house. She went to a suite at the Hotel Grand Duca Houston that Harrison had arranged, ordered room service, and spent the evening on a video call with Priya, going through preliminary financial documentation. Sterling issued a statement through Ashford Capital Group's communications director at 8 p.m. that night. It was 2 paragraphs. It said that the firm took financial integrity with the utmost seriousness and had cooperated fully with law enforcement. It did not mention Camille by name. It did not need to. The Houston business community was small enough that the message arrived where it was intended to. Eleanor Ashford called Sterling that evening to tell him she had always known. Vanessa texted him a single line, "Phase 1 complete." He did not respond, not because he disagreed, but because he had already begun to feel, in some wordless place beneath his confidence, a small and persistent unease. He could not identify its source. He dismissed it. He poured himself a bourbon and watched the lights of River Oaks from the study window. The unease stayed. What Sterling did not know, what he could not have known, because it existed in a layer of the world he had never been invited to see, was that Beaumont Capital Reserve had its own compliance infrastructure. Private banks of its caliber and structure did not merely rely on external regulators. They maintained internal financial intelligence operations, quiet, technically sophisticated, staffed by people whose job was to understand, at a granular level, the behavior of every significant account in the portfolio. The head of that function at Beaumont Capital Reserve was a woman named Denise Atchison. She was 53, originally from Atlanta, Georgia, a Howard University graduate who had spent 12 years at the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas before Louis Beaumont had personally recruited her by flying to Atlanta and taking her to dinner and explaining, over the course of 4 hours, exactly what he was building, and why he needed someone who believed in it. She had believed in it. She had spent the last 9 years ensuring that the institution he had built remained exactly what he intended it to be, unimpeachable. Denise had flagged the Ashford Capital account 3 months before the October dinner. The trigger was not dramatic. It was a pattern, the kind of subtle pattern that only sophisticated monitoring software catches. A series of transaction timings and counterparty relationships that, individually, explained themselves, but collectively produced a statistical signature that her systems identified as inconsistent with legitimate business operations. She had prepared a preliminary report. She had sent it, as protocol required, to Heiress & Cole, who had sent it, as his protocol required, to Camille. Camille had read it. She had not been entirely surprised. She had seen, over the previous year, small signs. Sterling's evasiveness about certain firm metrics, his new insistence on managing certain vendor relationships personally, an edginess in him that he covered with aggression. She had been watching and collecting, the way her father had taught her, waiting for the picture to clarify before acting. The arrest had accelerated the timeline. 3 days after Camille's release on bail, Denise Atchison and Priya Subramaniam sat together in a conference room at Cole, Laurent, and Washington, and began the formal process of correlating Beaumont Capital Reserve's internal findings with the forensic analysis Priya had initiated on the Ashford Capital transaction records. They worked for 11 hours that first day. They ordered Thai food. They did not leave the conference room until 1 in the morning. What they found was not subtle. The shell companies, Brightstone Advisory Partners, Ashfield Holding Solutions, Gulf Meridian Capital, appeared in the Ashford Capital records as vendor payments. They had been paid, repeatedly, for services described in contractual language that was vague enough to be nearly meaningless. Strategic advisory consultation, market analysis deliverables, operational alignment services. The amounts varied. The timing was irregular. The documentation, when examined closely, had the texture of something written with deliberate ambiguity. The counterparty accounts, the accounts to which the Ashford Capital payments had flowed, had their own histories. Priya traced them through 3 layers of interbank transfers. 2 of the 3 chains ultimately led to accounts in the name of Vanessa Bright or entities directly associated with her. The 3rd chain, the one associated with Gulf Meridian Capital, led to a personal account in the name of Sterling Ashford. That finding, by itself, was what attorneys called materially significant. In the language of ordinary people, it meant that the money Sterling had described as having been stolen by his wife had actually been moved, at least in part, directly into Sterling's own account. When Heiress & Cole reviewed the findings, he sat for a long moment in silence. Then he said, very quietly, "Lord." He called Camille. He walked her through the conclusions. She listened without interrupting. When he was done, she said, "How long do we need?" He said, 2 more weeks, maximum. We need to lock down the forensic chain before we make any move. We need the documentation to be airtight." She said, "All right." She was not angry. Or rather, she was angry, in the way that people who have been deeply and deliberately wronged are angry, with a heat that does not dissipate, but goes somewhere interior, somewhere useful. She was also something else, something that took her a moment to name. She was clear. She knew exactly what was happening. She knew exactly what the path forward required. And she knew, with a certainty that settled in her like ballast, that she held every card in this game. She simply had not laid them on the table yet. Sterling's legal team made contact with Harrison's office 12 days after the arrest. The lead attorney was a man named Bradford Weil, senior partner at Weil, Haggerty & Ross, downtown Houston, a firm that specialized in corporate law and had a well-established reputation for doing what was necessary. Bradford Weil was 64, silver-haired, and had a handshake like a vice grip, which he deployed at every possible opportunity, as if physical confidence could be billed by the hour. The proposal he conveyed was as follows. Camille would plead no contest to a reduced charge of improper access to financial records, a misdemeanor. She would sign a separation agreement that, in addition to the standard marital dissolution terms, would include a non-disclosure agreement, preventing her from making any public statements about Ashford Capital Group, its operations, or any matter related to the marriage. She would receive a cash settlement of $300,000. In exchange, the criminal complaint would be withdrawn, and the divorce would proceed without further litigation. Harrison Cole read the proposal. He set it down on his desk. He looked at Priya, who was seated across from him. Then he looked at Bradford Weil. "I'll convey it to my client," he said. He called Camille. She read the proposal. There was a pause. "No," she said. Simply, completely, without elaboration. "Camille, Harrison." No, he had expected this. "I want to make sure you understand the full picture before." "I understand the full picture better than anyone in this situation," she said. "He wants me silenced. That's what the NDA is for. He's not trying to resolve this. He's trying to contain it. And if I sign that agreement, the people who helped him frame me have no accountability. Darren Foss keeps his job. Vanessa stays exactly where she is. And the money he moved goes unremarked." "No." Harrison allowed himself a small smile that she couldn't see through the phone. "All right," he said. When Harrison relayed the rejection to Bradford Weil, the older attorney's composure tightened, almost imperceptibly. He said they would need to reconsider their position. Harrison said that was their right. Bradford Weil left the office. In his car in the parking garage, Bradford called Sterling. "She turned it down," he said. There was a silence on the other end. "That's not possible," Sterling said. "She turned it down," Bradford said again. Flat. No counteroffer, no negotiation posture, just no. The silence stretched. Then Sterling said, "What does she want?" Bradford paused. "I don't think she wants a settlement," he said, with the careful tone of a man who has begun to suspect he is not in possession of all the relevant facts. "I think she wants something else." He did not know what. He would find out. News of the arrest had moved through Houston's black professional community with the speed and particular texture of news that carries more than one story inside it. On the surface, a woman from a prominent family arrested on theft charges brought by her husband's firm. Beneath the surface, the complicated, layered, centuries-old story of what happens when a black woman with resources marries into a white family with ambition, and the family decides it no longer needs her. People who knew Camille, from Spelman, from her years in Houston's philanthropic community, from the professional networks she had cultivated with her mother's methodical care, did not believe the charges. Not because they were naive, but because they knew her. They knew her precision, her ethics, her absolute refusal to cut corners in any context. They also knew, many of them, enough about Sterling Ashford to form their own assessments. Camille's mother, Isabel, flew in from New Orleans the day after the arrest. She was 64 years old and moved through the world with the quiet authority of a woman who had been underestimated her entire life and had used every moment of it. She arrived at the Hotel Granduca, embraced her daughter for a long time without speaking, and then sat down and said, "Tell me everything." Camille did. When she was finished, Isabel was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your father's arrangement. Harrison knows to activate it when the time comes." "Yes," Camille said. "And the time is coming?" "Yes, soon." Isabel nodded. She looked out the window at Houston's skyline, the city where she had raised her daughter, the city her husband had loved, the city where a man had tried to use its systems to destroy what her family had spent generations building. "Your father always said," Isabel began. "I know, Mama," Camille said softly. "He said the ones who try to take what's yours will always, always leave a trail. Because they can't help it. Because arrogance is loud, even when it's trying to be quiet." Camille looked at her mother. He was right. Meanwhile, in River Oaks, the Ashford family was conducting its own kind of processing. Eleanor had moved through the arrest with a satisfaction she did not entirely try to conceal. She had always believed Camille was wrong for Sterling, and she filed this event under confirmation. Beau and his wife Dana were nervous in the way that people who have family money adjacent to a scandal are nervous. Not about the ethics, but about the optics. Reginald was quiet. It was Reginald, actually, who was the most interesting figure in the Ashford family dynamic during this period. He had been at the dinner. He had heard Sterling's accusation. He had sat there and said nothing, and the saying of nothing had required from him a significant and visible effort that his wife, a sharp woman named Thea, had noticed and filed away. Reginald and Camille had always had a cordial relationship. Nothing close, nothing warm, but respectful. He had thought, over the years, that she was steadier than Sterling. He had also thought, without being able to articulate it, that there was something about her he did not fully understand, and that the thing he didn't understand was probably important. He did not call her after the arrest. But he also did not say anything publicly in support of Sterling's version of events. And in the Ashford family, silence was its own kind of statement. By the end of the third week, Priya and Marcus had assembled what they privately called the package, a forensic financial analysis of over 1,100 pages, supported by bank records, transaction logs, digital access metadata, shell company formation documents, beneficial ownership traces, and wire transfer confirmations, that established, with what Harrison described as the kind of clarity that gives prosecutors nightmares, the full arc of the scheme that Sterling Ashford and Vanessa Bright had constructed. The access credentials that had been used to generate the false transaction records attributed to Camille had been created from an IP address that traced to Ashford Capital Group's internal network, specifically to a workstation in the compliance department assigned to Darren Foss. The metadata on the documents that comprised Sterling's evidence showed creation dates of October 2nd through October 10th, the 12 days immediately preceding the dinner on the 14th. The documents had been created, not discovered. The digital forensics also recovered something that Sterling had not accounted for: a series of draft emails between Sterling's personal email account and Vanessa's, recovered through a legal preservation notice that Harrison had served on the email provider before any deletions could occur, in which the two of them had explicitly discussed the attribution strategy, the decision to name a specific dollar figure, the choice of Camille's credentials, the timing relative to the dinner. One email, sent by Vanessa to Sterling on October 8th, read in part, "The number needs to be under 3 million, or it triggers a different threshold for the DA's office. Stick to the 2.3. Darren has the access logs formatted the way we discussed. She won't fight it. She'll want it to go away quietly. They always do. They always do." When Harrison showed that email to Camille, she read it once. She set it down. She looked at the window for a moment. "She thought she knew me," Camille said. "She didn't know you at all," Harrison said. "No," Camille said. "She knew the woman she assumed I was." That's not the same thing. The federal angle had also by this point come into focus, because the shell companies were registered across multiple states and the financial transfers involved interstate wire movements. The scheme met the threshold for federal wire fraud consideration. Marcus had been in conversation with a contact at the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of Texas for several days. The conversation had been, as he described it to Harrison, productive. The plan was now clear. Harrison would file a motion to dismiss the criminal complaint against Camille, supported by the forensic evidence that comprehensively demolished the prosecution's case. Simultaneously, he would file a civil complaint against Sterling Ashford, Vanessa Bright, Darren Foss, and the 3 shell companies for financial fraud, defamation, and malicious prosecution. The U.S. Attorney's contact would receive the full forensic package, which would inform a separate federal investigation. And then, at a moment of their choosing, a moment that would be precisely timed, Camille would do something she had never done before. She would introduce herself. While the legal machinery was assembling itself, something was happening at Beaumont Capital Reserve that Sterling Ashford was not yet aware of. The protocol that Denise Atchison had initiated, the one triggered by the Ashford Capital account irregularities, had entered a second phase. Under the terms of the Ashford Capital Group's banking agreement with Beaumont Capital Reserve, the bank retained the right, in cases of documented internal misconduct by the account holder's principals, to conduct an enhanced account review, restrict certain transaction categories pending the review, and, if the review confirmed the initial findings, to proceed to formal account remediation under the applicable banking regulations. The review had confirmed the initial findings, substantially. On October the 31st, Halloween, which struck Priya as appropriate, Denise Atchison formally initiated account remediation proceedings against Ashford Capital Group's primary operating account, corporate credit facilities, and associated sub-accounts at Beaumont Capital Reserve. The practical effect of this was significant. Ashford Capital Group's ability to access liquidity through its primary banking relationship was, pending the remediation process, substantially constrained. Certain automatic disbursements, payroll funding transfers, vendor payment authorizations, a line of credit draw that Bo Ashford had been expecting to process for a real estate acquisition, were placed in a review queue. The firm's relationship manager, Mr. Claude Whitfield, called Sterling's office on October 31st at 11 a.m. He delivered the news in the calm, measured tone of a man who has had difficult financial conversations for a living and has made peace with the fact that the people on the other end often take them personally. Sterling received the call in his office. He was standing at his window, where he had been standing quite a lot recently. He listened to what Whitfield described. He asked 3 questions, each of which Whitfield answered with a precision that did not leave room for argument. When the call ended, Sterling stood very still for a moment. Then he called Bradford Weil. Then he called Bo. Then he sat down. Because his legs had gone somewhat unreliable, he could not understand it. The bank that had always been, in his mind, simply a reliable institutional partner, a background element, a feature of the landscape, was behaving in a way he had never imagined it could. He had not read the full account agreement in years. He had not thought to. Banks, in Sterling's experience, were things you used. They were not things that looked back at you. He called Bradford Weil again. He told him about the bank. Bradford said he would look into it. He looked into it. He called Sterling back 2 hours later. The account remediation is legitimate, Bradford said. The authority for it is in the agreement. It's not something we can easily challenge. Who authorized it? Sterling asked. The bank's compliance officer. Under whose authority? There was a pause. Ultimately, the controlling beneficiary of the institution. Who is the controlling beneficiary? Another pause. A longer one. I'm still trying to establish that, Bradford said. The ownership structure is a trust arrangement through a Delaware holding entity. It's not immediately transparent. Sterling did not understand yet. He was close to understanding. He could feel the edge of something he could not name, but he was not there yet. He told Bradford to find out. He told him to find out immediately. Bradford said he would do his best. He called back the following day. He did not have good news. On November the 4th at 9 a.m., Heiress & Cole filed a motion to dismiss all charges against Camille Beaumont Ashford in Harris County Criminal Court. The filing ran to 67 pages and was accompanied by 412 pages of exhibits. The exhibits included the digital forensics report on the fabricated access logs, the IP trace to Darren Foss's workstation, the recovered email correspondence between Sterling and Vanessa, the beneficial ownership documentation for the 3 shell companies, and the wire transfer records establishing Sterling's personal account as the ultimate destination of a portion of the extracted funds. The filing was a matter of public record. By 11 a.m., it had been accessed by 6 different reporters. By 2 p.m., the Houston Chronicle had a story online. By 5 p.m., it had been picked up by the Associated Press. The story was brief. A motion to dismiss, allegations of fabricated evidence, counterclaims in development, but it was enough. The business community that had received Sterling's earlier statement with concern now received this development with something closer to alarm. The word fabricated appeared in the first paragraph of every version of the story. In the world Sterling operated in, that word, in that context, was approximately as damaging as a building fire. Sterling's phone began ringing in ways it had not rung before. Investors in funds managed by Ashford Capital Group called. Their lawyers called. The chairman of a charitable foundation whose endowment had a portion invested through the firm called. These were not panicked calls, not yet. They were careful, measured, the kind of calls that sophisticated people make when they want information without committing to a position. But the frequency and timing of them told their own story. Sterling issued a statement through Bradford's office, characterizing the motion as a litigation strategy, not a statement of fact, and asserting that the firm stood fully behind the integrity of the original complaint. Bradford privately told him the statement would have limited impact. Sterling privately knew he was right. In the Ashford Capital Group's conference room, a meeting took place that evening between Sterling, Bo, Reginald, and the firm's general counsel. a woman named Patricia Osei, who had joined the firm 3 years ago and who was, in the estimation of everyone who knew her, the most ethically grounded person on the firm's payroll by a considerable margin. Patricia had been reviewing the situation for several days with growing discomfort. She sat down across from the three brothers, and she asked Sterling, with professional directness, to tell her specifically what had happened. The way Sterling answered, the slight over-precision, the sequential framing, the absence of the kind of authentic indignation that an innocent person commands naturally, told Patricia what she needed to know. She did not say this out loud. She absorbed it. She made a note in her personal file. She would have a conversation with her own attorney in the morning. Reginald, sitting in the corner of the conference room, watched his brother perform the version of events he had prepared, and felt, with a clarity that had been building for weeks, that he was sitting in the room with a man he did not entirely recognize. He drove home that evening in silence. He told Thea what he was thinking. Thea listened. When he was finished, she said, "Then you know what you need to do." He did know. The hearing on the motion to dismiss was scheduled for November the 19th. It was a Tuesday. The courtroom was not large, a standard Harris County criminal courtroom. Wooden benches, fluorescent lighting, the particular institutional smell of a building where the stakes are always high and the furniture is always old. But by 9 a.m., every seat was filled. Reporters occupied the press section. Several attorneys who had no role in the proceeding were present, simply because word had gotten around that this was a hearing worth watching. Sterling arrived with Bradford Weil and 2 associates from the firm. He was dressed well. Charcoal suit, white shirt, no tie, an attempt at the kind of studied casualness that reads in courtrooms as confidence. He sat at the defense table, though formally, this was Camille's hearing, not his, and he arranged his face into the expression of a man waiting patiently for a misunderstanding to resolve itself. Camille arrived with Harrison Cole, Priya, and Marcus. She was wearing a deep navy suit, her hair up, her posture the same posture she had carried her entire adult life, straight, unhurried, complete. She sat at the plaintiff's table, and she did not look at Sterling. The judge was the Honorable Renata Washington, a 57-year-old woman who had been on the bench for 14 years and who was known, among Houston attorneys, for 2 things: an absolute impatience with any attempt to waste her time, and an equally absolute commitment to following the evidence wherever it led. She was black, from Houston's 3rd Ward originally, and she wore her authority the way people wear clothes they've had for a long time, naturally, comfortably, without needing to announce it. The hearing began. Harrison walked Judge Washington through the evidence systematically, without theatrics, without flourishes, without the kind of performative passion that was, in his view, for television and not for courtrooms, where facts were available. He presented the digital forensics. He presented the IP trace. He presented the recovered emails. He presented the shell company documentation. He presented the beneficial ownership trace. He presented the wire transfer records showing Sterling's personal account. Judge Washington asked questions. They were the questions of someone who was following every thread and pulling on each one to test its strength. She asked about the methodology of the IP trace. She asked about the chain of custody for the email recovery. She asked about the timestamps on the fabricated documents. Harrison answered each question, and when he needed to, Priya answered from the technical analyst's chair. The answers were clear. They were consistent. They were supported by documentation that was right there, in the exhibits, available for review. Bradford Weil objected several times. The objections were procedural, not substantive. They were the objections of an attorney who knows the ground is shifting beneath his client, but is obligated to hold position as long as possible. The hearing ran for 3 hours. At 12:47 p.m., Judge Washington called a 15-minute recess. She returned at 1 o'clock. She dismissed all charges against Camille Renee Beaumont Ashford. The language of her ruling was precise and, in its precision, devastating. She stated that the evidence presented overwhelmingly established that the documentation underlying the original complaint had been fabricated. She stated that the fabrication appeared to have been deliberate, coordinated, and premeditated. She ordered that the full record of the proceedings be preserved and forwarded to the Harris County District Attorney's Office and the U.S. Attorney's Office for consideration of appropriate action. She stated that the court found the conduct that had led to the wrongful arrest of the defendant to be among the most troubling it had reviewed in 14 years on the bench. She looked at Sterling Ashford when she said that last sentence. He was very still. The room was not still. There was a specific quality of sound. Not chaos, but a collective release of breath, a shuffling, a murmuring, the sound of many people simultaneously updating their understanding of a situation. Reporters were writing. Attorneys were leaning toward each other. Someone near the back clapped once and was immediately hushed. Harrison turned to Camille. He said nothing. There was nothing necessary to say in this moment. He simply looked at her with the expression of a man who has done his job and knows it. She looked at him with gratitude that she kept, characteristically, measured and quiet. Then she turned, and for the first time since the hearing began, she looked at Sterling. He looked back at her, in his face, and she watched it carefully, because she had been watching his face for a long time. She saw something she had not seen before. Not guilt exactly, not remorse. Something closer to the dawning, physical recognition of the size of what he had miscalculated. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked away. Outside the courthouse, on the steps, Harrison spoke to the assembled press. He was brief. He confirmed that the charges against his client had been dismissed. He confirmed that civil litigation against Sterling Ashford, Vanessa Bright, Darren Foss, and the 3 shell companies had been filed that morning in Harris County Civil Court. He confirmed that the matter had been referred to federal law enforcement. He said that his client would be making a statement in due course. A reporter called out, "Can you say anything about the banking relationship? There are reports that Ashford Capital Group is facing issues with its primary bank." Harrison paused, almost imperceptibly. Then he said, "My client will be making a statement in due course." He left the podium. The reporter with the banking question was sharper than she knew. 3 days after the dismissal, on Friday, November the 22nd, Camille Beaumont Ashford issued a statement. It was not a press conference. It was not a social media post. It was a written statement, released simultaneously to the Houston Chronicle, the Houston Business Journal, the Wall Street Journal's Texas desk, and a national wire service. It was 2 pages long. Harrison had reviewed every word. Priya had reviewed the financial disclosures. Isabel had read it the night before and said, "Your father would be proud." The statement began with the facts of the arrest and the dismissal. Brief, factual, without emotional language, simply the record. It then addressed, with equal brevity, the nature of the scheme that had been employed against her and the status of the civil and federal proceedings. Then it turned to something that had not yet appeared in any of the reporting. It said, "I am the controlling beneficiary of the Beaumont Family Preservation Trust, which holds a majority interest in Beaumont Capital Reserve, LLC, a private investment banking institution headquartered in Houston, Texas, with approximately $5 billion in assets under management. My father, Louis René Beaumont, founded this institution. He built it with the understanding that the people who most needed protection from the arbitrary exercise of financial power were often those with the least institutional access to the tools that provide it. He built it quietly, deliberately, and with integrity. I have honored that work. Among the corporate banking clients of Beaumont Capital Reserve is Ashford Capital Group, the firm whose principals orchestrated my arrest on fabricated charges. I did not disclose this relationship during my marriage, because I am not obligated to disclose my financial holdings to anyone. I disclose it now because the public record warrants it, and because silence, in this context, would be its own kind of dishonesty. The account remediation currently in process with respect to Ashford Capital Group's banking relationship with Beaumont Capital Reserve is proceeding in accordance with the institution's standard regulatory protocols and the terms of the relevant account agreement. It is independent of the civil and criminal proceedings, and it is being conducted by the institution's compliance function without my direction. I would not direct it. That is not how the institution operates. What I will say, because I believe it to be important, is this. My father believed that wealth, when accumulated by people who have historically been excluded from it, carries a particular obligation, not to perform that wealth, not to announce it, but to use it in the service of something larger than personal comfort. He built Beaumont Capital Reserve not to prove something to the world, but to create a structure through which capital could be directed with both rigor and conscience. I intend to continue that work. I have nothing further to say about my marriage, my former husband, or the people who believed they could frame me, silence me, and walk away. The courts and the relevant federal authorities will say what remains to be said on those subjects. I will not. The statement landed in Houston's financial community like a stone dropped into still water. The circles expanded in every direction. The moment Sterling Ashford read Camille's statement, he was sitting at his desk in the Ashford Capital Group offices on Post Oak Boulevard. It was 9:47 a.m. He was alone. His assistant had brought him coffee. The coffee was still in its cup, untouched, cooling. He read the statement once, then he read it again. The sentence that he returned to, the one that he read 4 times, that he then set down and then picked up and read again, was the one about Beaumont Capital Reserve. He thought about the bank. He thought about the years of banking with them. He thought about Mr. Claude Whitfield's pleasant voice and first-ring call answering. He thought about the favorable terms. He thought about the account remediation that had been restricting his access to liquidity for 3 weeks. He thought about the dinner on October 14th, and the table, and Camille at the far end of it in her burgundy dress. He thought about what it meant that she had been sitting there, at that table, in that house, at that dinner, knowing that the bank he had built his firm around, the bank he relied on for operational continuity, was hers. He had called the police to that house. He had watched her be handcuffed beneath the Italian chandelier. He had handed a folder of fabricated documents to law enforcement, and she had gone. She had gone quietly. She had not said, "I own your bank." She had not said, "You have no idea who I am." She had said, "That is not accurate." And then she had been walked out of the house, and she had made one phone call, and she had kept her hands folded in her lap in the holding cell, and she had refused to sign anything, and she had waited. Sterling Ashford was a man who had spent his entire life operating from a position of assumed advantage, the advantage of his name, his race, his gender, his network, his family's money, the way the world had always tilted slightly toward him in rooms where it mattered. He had never, until this moment, encountered the experience of discovering that the tilt had been, all along, in the other direction, that the floor he had been standing on belonged to someone else, and that someone else had simply been waiting to see what he would do with it. His hands were trembling. He noticed them, and he put them flat on the desk to make them stop. They didn't stop. He called Bradford Weil. Bradford did not have good news. The civil complaint filed by Harrison's firm was extensive and well supported. The federal inquiry was, according to Bradford's sources, moving faster than federal inquiries typically moved, which was a sign that the U.S. Attorney's Office believed they had a strong case. And the Beaumont Capital Reserve situation, the bank, the ownership, all of it, was not something they could contest. The statement had been made. The trust documentation was apparently unimpeachable. There was no angle of attack. "What are my options?" Sterling asked. Bradford was quiet for a moment. When a defense attorney is quiet in response to that question, the quiet itself is an answer. "Cooperation," Bradford said at last. "If you want to minimize federal exposure, cooperation with the investigation is your strongest card at this point." Sterling said nothing. "Sterling," Bradford said, "I need you to hear me. The email evidence alone, the email to Vanessa about the 2.3 million figure, that is a conspiracy to commit fraud, framed and sent in writing. That is not a matter of interpretation. That is a documented conversation about an intentional scheme. Combined with the financial trail, the shell companies, and the wire transfers to your personal account, we are not in a territory where defense is the primary strategy. We are in a territory where how you proceed from this moment determines what the next chapter of your life looks like." Sterling hung up. He sat at his desk for a long time. Outside, Houston moved through its day. Traffic on Post Oak, a delivery at the building's loading dock, a flight overhead descending toward Hobby Airport. None of it knew. None of it cared. The world did not organize itself around his crisis. It never had. He had simply, until now, had enough insulation that he'd never been made to feel that. Reginald Ashford called Camille on the Saturday after the statement was published. She answered, which surprised him. He was standing in his backyard in his Bel Air home, his coffee going cold in his hand, the way Sterling's had. "Camille," he said. "Reginald," she said. There was a pause. He searched for language that was adequate and found, as people often do in these situations, that there wasn't any. "I didn't know," he said, "what he was doing. I want you to know that I didn't know." "I believe you," she said, and she meant it. "I should have," he started. "You sat at that table," she said. "You didn't validate what he did. You didn't say what you could have said. I noticed that." Another pause. "That's not nothing, Reginald." He exhaled. "Is there anything?" "No," she said, not unkindly. "There's nothing for you to do. Let the process work. Take care of your family." A beat. "Take care of yourself." She ended the call. Eleanor Ashford, to the surprise of no one who understood her, issued no statement, made no call, and offered no acknowledgement of what had been done to her daughter-in-law in her house at her table. She continued to attend her weekly luncheon at the River Oaks Country Club. She wore her pearls. She told her friends that the situation was complicated. Her friends, who read the news, told her it did not appear complicated. Bo and Dana hired their own attorney. They were not charged with anything. They had not participated in the scheme, but they had financial exposure through the firm's liability, and the prospect of being deposed in civil proceedings concentrated their attention considerably. Darren Foss, the compliance officer who had fabricated the access logs, retained an attorney and, within 2 weeks of the statement's publication, entered into a cooperation agreement with the U.S. Attorney's Office. He provided a detailed account of his involvement, the creation of the false documentation, the instructions from Sterling, the specifics of the credential manipulation. He was not a sympathetic figure, but he was a useful one, and the information he provided added significant weight to what was already an extensively documented case. Vanessa Bright attempted, in the weeks following the motion to dismiss, to distance herself from the scheme. She retained a criminal defense attorney and initially maintained that she had been unaware of any fraudulent intent. This position did not survive contact with the email evidence, which was specific, dated, and authored by her. She was ultimately indicted on 6 counts of wire fraud, 2 counts of conspiracy, and 1 count of money laundering. Her attorney subsequently began negotiations with the U.S. Attorney's Office. Sterling Ashford was indicted on 8 counts. The proceedings would take 2 years. He would ultimately enter a plea agreement. The details of that agreement are a matter of public record in the Southern District of Texas. The divorce was finalized. The terms were not the terms he had proposed in October. They were the terms that resulted from a civil judgment that accounted for the damages, financial and otherwise, that the scheme had imposed on Camille. The number in the judgment would have made Darren Foss's 1-sentence email to Vanessa, "She won't fight it," look like the most expensive 7 words he had ever helped craft. 6 months after the dismissal, Camille stood in a conference room at Beaumont Capital Reserve and addressed a group of 30 employees, the core staff of the institution her father had built. She had not done this before. She had been, until this point, the invisible hand, the controlling beneficiary, the name in the trust document, the authority on the other side of Denise Atchison's quarterly reports. She had never stood in the room as herself. She was wearing a cream blazer. She had her mother's precision and her father's calm. She looked at the people who had worked for years in an institution they knew was privately held, professionally rigorous, and ultimately controlled by a person they had never met. "My father believed," she said, "that a financial institution, like any institution, is only as trustworthy as the clarity of its purpose. He built this place with a purpose. It was not to make money. Any institution of this kind makes money. That is not a purpose. That is a mechanism. The purpose was to ensure that capital could move in ways that were accountable, transparent on the inside, even when private on the outside, and directed by people who had something real at stake." He had something real at stake. So do I. She paused. "You have operated this institution faithfully, many of you for years, without knowing the face behind the structure. I want you to know it now, not because the institution changes, it doesn't, but because I believe that the people who do the work deserve to know who they are working for." There was no applause. It was not that kind of moment. But the room had a quality to it afterward, a settled, clarified quality that Denise Atchison, who had worked in finance for 30 years and had seen many rooms go many ways, would later describe as the feeling of a foundation being confirmed. There is a final thing about this story that deserves to be understood, perhaps the most important thing of all, the one that everything else has been leading toward. Camille had not built a wall around herself out of bitterness. She had not kept the secret of her inheritance out of calculation or strategy, though both would have justified it. She had kept it, at first, out of simple privacy, the understanding, absorbed from her father's example, that the first protection of what you own is the protection of what others know about what you own. But as the marriage progressed, as Sterling's ambition became clearer, as the warmth she had believed in faded to performance, as she catalogued the small and steady accumulation of disrespect, she had kept the secret for a second reason. She was watching. She was testing. Not him specifically, she was not that transactional, but the situation. She was asking herself a question that her father had taught her to ask. What does this person do with the power they believe they have? What do they do with it when they think no one is watching? She had her answer. She had known, with something approaching certainty, that the marriage was not salvageable, for at least 18 months before the October dinner. She had been preparing quietly, not for conflict, but for clarity. She had consulted Harrison. She had reviewed the trust structures. She had been in the process of building the groundwork for an orderly exit when Sterling accelerated the timeline in the most dramatic, most public, most consequential way available to him. She had been ready, not because she had predicted exactly what he would do, but because she had spent her life being ready. Her father had understood that the world would test her in ways it would not test men who looked like Sterling, and he had given her every tool he had to pass those tests with her dignity, not just intact, but confirmed. The arrest, in the end, had not broken her. It had done what nothing else could have done so cleanly. It had given the world the chance to see the full picture. She had not needed to perform toughness that October evening beneath the chandelier. She had not needed to announce herself or defend herself or demonstrate anything to anyone in that dining room. She had walked out the door, made one phone call, and set in motion the machinery that had always been waiting. There is a kind of patience that looks like passivity until the moment it doesn't. There is a kind of silence that registers as absence until the moment its presence is fully understood. Camille Beaumont Ashford had both. She had always had both. 2 years after the arrest, on a Wednesday morning in October, a year and a day after the anniversary of the dinner, Camille sat in the Houston office of a small nonprofit she had recently established. The organization was called the Beaumont Foundation for Financial Equity, and its stated purpose was to provide financial literacy resources, legal support, and access to institutional banking relationships for Black and mixed-race entrepreneurs in Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Georgia. It had a staff of 8. It had already served 312 clients in its first year. It had received an endowment from Beaumont Capital Reserve's Community Investment Fund. She was reviewing a grant proposal when her assistant, a 24-year-old woman named Toya from Houston's 3rd Ward, knocked and asked if she had a moment. She did. Toya said there was a reporter outside, a young man from the Houston Business Journal who had called ahead and been told there were no media appearances scheduled. He had come anyway. He had a single question. He wanted to know if she would answer it, what she would say to young women, specifically young Black women, specifically young mixed-race women, who were watching what had happened to her and trying to understand what it meant. Camille thought about this for a moment. "Tell him I'll speak to him for 5 minutes," she said. She went to the small lobby. The young reporter was maybe 26, notebook in hand, a nervousness about him that she recognized as the nervousness of someone who wasn't sure he deserved to be in the room. She appreciated that. Unearned confidence was so exhausting. "What's your question?" she said. He cleared his throat. "What do you want young women who saw your story to take away from it? Like, what's the lesson?" She looked at him. She thought about the dinner, the handcuffs, the holding cell, the recovered emails, the forensic reports, the courtroom, the judge's words, the trembling hands that Bradford Weil had described over the phone, in a voice she had heard through the wall of Harrison's office. She thought about her father dancing with her at her wedding, whispering in her ear, She thought about her mother arriving at the hotel, the long embrace before anything was said. She thought about herself at 17, sitting beside her father in the back of a meeting room in a building in New Orleans, watching men in suits who did not know she was there negotiate with the man who owned the building, and her father saying quietly, when they left, "What did you learn?" And her answering, and him nodding, and her understanding, even then, that the most important lesson was not about the negotiation, or the numbers, or the building. It was about the fact that he had brought her to the room. "I don't know that I'd call it a lesson," she said to the reporter. "A lesson implies there was something I needed to learn that I didn't already know. My father taught me what I needed to know before I was old enough to drive." She paused. "But if I had to say something, I'd say this. The people who try to diminish you are always operating from incomplete information. They see what they decide to see. They assume what they've always assumed, and they are almost always wrong about something they think they're certain of." She looked at him evenly. "The work is to know what you know, to build what you build, to let them be wrong, and to be prepared for the day they find out." The young reporter looked at her. He had stopped writing. "Thank you," he said. "You're welcome," she said. She went back to the grant proposal. Outside, October light came through the window in that warm, angled way it does in Houston, clarifying everything, leaving nothing in shadow that didn't choose to be. Thank you for staying with us to the end of this story. If you enjoyed this story, comment below what part got you excited. Also comment where you are watching from and what time it is in your country. I would love to read all your comments and also know where my community members are from. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on more interesting stories. See you all in our next story.